Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 132, Meno 92e to 93b. Anytus has just claimed that any decent Athenian would make Meno better than any sophist. But then he adds, if he wishes to be persuaded, which is a strange thing to say if decent Athenians make other Athenians decent simply by being a role model. It looks as though Anytus has been influenced by the discussion to treat even a decent Athenian as someone who gives advice and in this way influences others. They certainly don't teach the way that sophists teach because they are not paid for giving their advice. We have seen that from Meno's point of view, if there is no payment, there is no teaching. It's interesting then that Socrates presses the point about learning and teaching. Poteron de hutoi hoi kaloi kagathoi apotu automatu egenonto toiutoi, parudenos mathontes, homos mentoi allus didasken hoioite ontes tauta ha autoi uk emathon. Did these fine and good men become such spontaneously, having learnt from no one, and yet nevertheless being able to teach others these things which they themselves didn't learn? Kai tutus ego ge axio paraton proteron mathen onton kalon kagathon, udoku sisoi polloi kai agathoi gegonenai entedete pole andres. These two, I think, learned from the former, the ones who were fine and good. Don't there seem to be to you to have been many and good men in this city? Anytus seems to be questioning Socrates' patriotism here. So far as Anytus is concerned, if the citizens of Athens are fine and good, and teach others to be fine and good, then Socrates himself should know that, being a citizen of Athens. It doesn't seem to occur to Anytus that Socrates might think that the fine and good citizens of Athens don't actually teach other people to be fine and good. Anytus simply goes for the more dangerous conclusion that Socrates doesn't think that there are fine and good citizens at all in Athens. This is dangerous because after the war with Sparta, many people are now looking for traitors, people in Athens who don't seem to appear to support the democracy. This would derail the conversation about education, so Socrates immediately removes all doubt and returns the conversation to teachers and students. Emoige o anite, kai enai dokusi enthade agathoi ta politika, kai gegonenai eti ucheton enai. There seem to me indeed, Anytus, to be here good people with regard to affairs of the polis, and to have been good people, even not less than the ones who are now. In other words, the people of the past and the people of the present appear equally good with regard to affairs of the polis. This doesn't mean that Socrates actually thinks that they are good. They appear good. When it comes to Socrates, it's not immediately obvious that people who appear good to him are people he thinks are actually good, but he is aware that they appear to be good, the way that they appear to be good to other people. Anyway, as he's about to say himself, The argument here isn't about whether they are good or not, but whether they actually can teach, and particularly whether they can teach their arete, that sort of virtue which is what a typical Athenian decent gentleman has. Ala mon kai didaskaloi agathoi gegonas in tes hauton aretes, but they surely haven't become good teachers of their virtue. Tutogar estin perihuho logos hemin tun chaneon, for our conversation happens to be about this. Uk esin agathoi me andres enthade, ude gegonas in ento prosthen, al didacton estin arete palai scopumen. Not if there are or are not good men here, nor if there have been in the past, but for a long time we have been investigating if virtue is something teachable. One of Meno's 4 options at the beginning of the dialogue was whether virtue is something teachable, and recently it has come up again in conversation because Meno doesn't want to think for himself, and Socrates chose this particular option to examine, and they have indeed been examining this for quite a while now, and particularly with Anytus, looking for teachers, as if that would prove whether something was teachable. Something could be teachable, but as yet there are no teachers or students of that subject, and on the other hand, there are teachers claiming to be able to teach one thing or another, and yet there are people like Anytus who claim that those are not teachers, they are charlatans. Proving that a subject is teachable would require something like the hypothesis that Socrates raised, that the subject is one form or other of episteme, knowledge or understanding, regardless of teachers. Tutode scopuntes, tode scopumen, ara hoi agathoi andres, kaiton nun kaiton proteron, tauten ten araten hen autoi agathoi esan, epistanto kai allo paradunai, u paradoton tuto anthropo, ude paralepton allo par allu, tut estin ho pallai zitumen egoticae menon. Investigating this, we investigate this, the following thing, whether good men, both of now and of former times, understood how to pass on to someone else this virtue according to which they themselves were good, or whether this is not something transmissible to a person, nor something which may be taken by someone from someone else. This is what Meno and I have been investigating for a long time. This, in fact, is something Socrates has only now brought up. Before now, they were simply asking who the teachers were. They hadn't considered the problem of transmitting knowledge from one person to another. The closest we've come to an account of the acquisition of knowledge in this dialogue has been the so-called theory of recollection, the story about the reincarnation of the soul, which has seen everything in this world and in Hades, and has therefore acquired all knowledge, and it is now up to the human who has absolutely no knowledge to look inwards and recall the knowledge which is locked up in the soul. This account of the acquisition of knowledge left no room for teachers, and yet much of the conversation before was about trying to remember what Gorgias had said about virtue, and afterwards Socrates has apparently been trying to identify who the people are who could teach virtue. We should note the differences between the sophist who teaches virtue and the Athenian citizen, as Anytus portrays him, who claims to teach virtue. And one of the differences, of course, is that the sophist makes money from teaching, while the Athenian citizen doesn't. But another significant difference is that the sophist doesn't claim to have the virtue which he teaches. Gorgias doesn't even teach virtue at all. What Gorgias teaches is how to appear to be wise by teaching people how to answer any question they are asked. And among other questions asked is, what is arete, what is virtue? And Gorgias gives a very generous answer in which he goes through all the different types of virtues that there are according to gender, age, and status. He doesn't teach how to acquire virtue, he simply defines what virtue is and which virtue is appropriate to which person. Anytus, on the other hand, regards decent Athenian citizens as good, meaning that they have the virtue which he claims they can teach others. Since this is the case, it was not unfair of Socrates to begin their search for the teachers who could teach Meno this virtue by beginning with craftsmen. A shoemaker has the craft of shoemaking and therefore can teach it. A tanner has the craft of tanning and therefore can teach it. It would seem to follow that a good man is someone who has a virtue, and it is because he has that virtue that he can teach that virtue to others. At least that would appear to be the assumption Anytus makes. It's tempting to compare Anytus's decent Athenian citizens with the Thessalian horse breeders, who are evidently also able to transmit their virtue down the generations. They are well reputed for horse breeding, while the Athenians are well reputed for hosting xenoi and looking after parents.